Good afternoon. Welcome to Preservation Connecticut's Spring 2024 series, talking about preservation, our noontime chats about everything preservation. I'm Jane Montanaro, Executive Director of Preservation Connecticut, and I'm pleased to be your host. Today we are chatting with Dr. Jessie Nasta from Wesleyan University about the Beman Triangle in Middletown, one of the earliest free Black neighborhoods in Connecticut. This small activist community had a significant role in Black freedom and resilience in the state before the Civil War. But before we explore that story, I'd like to share background about Preservation Connecticut. Preservation Connecticut is the statewide private nonprofit historic preservation organization established in 1975 by a special act of the Connecticut General Assembly as the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation to preserve, protect, and promote the building sites and landscapes that contribute to the heritage and vitality of Connecticut's communities. We are statutory partners with the Connecticut State Historic Preservation Office, and I'm proud to say that for 49 years, we have successfully championed the protection of remarkable community assets all over the state by leveraging funding, advocating, forming partnerships, and promoting stewardship. Our office is located in the Eli Whitney Boarding House on Whitney Avenue in Hampden. It's listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It's the only surviving residential structure of the industrial village that's centered on Eli Whitney's armory. It has served as Preservation Connecticut's headquarters since 1989. We have a staff of 9 preservation professionals and a board of 19 preservationists from around the state. Staff listed here are always available to assist with inquiries. Christopher Wiegren is our Deputy Director. Contact Chris for information on historic preservation easements, our bi-monthly magazine, Connecticut Preservation News, our Olmsted in Connecticut survey, or to arrange a book talk for his book, Connecticut Architecture, Stories of 100 Places. Renee Trubert is our Making Places and Preservation Services Manager. Please contact Renee for information on redevelopment of historic industrial sites and tax credit applications. Jordan Sorensen is our Development and Special Projects Manager. Jordan manages our communications and outreach to members through social media and email, receives and monitors demolition notices from municipalities, and prepares historic tax credit applications and nominations to the State and National Register of Historic Places. Kristen Hopewood is our Membership and Outreach Manager. She manages all of the inquiries that come through our website, provides member services, arranges special events, and is the editor of our Historic Properties Exchange, a free listing of threatened historic properties. And finally, our team of circuit riders, Mike Farino, Brad Scheid, Stacy Vero, and Stefan Danchuk. They provide immediate boots-on-the-ground service to homeowners, developers, municipal leaders, nonprofit organizations and museums, historic district commissions, and much more, with an array of preservation technical assistance, including community organizing, prioritizing maintenance and repairs, historic designations, funding, and archaeology. These lunchtime chats have become an important and enjoyable tool for us to meet our mission. We're able to connect with the public and hear what's on your mind. Please feel free to use the chat feature to ask questions directly at the end of the program, or contact us afterwards for a call or a site visit. This is our last virtual session for the spring series. We'll be in person at the Barnes Museum in Southington this Saturday, May 18th, from 11 to 1, for a tour of the 15-room Historic House Museum and Center for the Study of 19th Century Material Culture and Decorative Arts. I hope to see you there. So now I'm going to introduce Jessie to you. Jessie Nasta, PhD, is a professor at Wesleyan University's Department of African American Studies, and he is executive director of the Middlesex County Historical Society. Jessie began researching the Beman Triangle as a Wesleyan University student in 2006, and is writing a book about this remarkable neighborhood and its regional, national, and global connections to 19th century Black community and anti-slavery networks. So welcome, Dr. Nasta, and I will let you take over the screen. I'm going to stop sharing.
Great. So you can see my slides.
Yes, perfect.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a really pleasure to be here. Thank you. So I'll just start by saying that I am a historian by training. My background is in history. I'm becoming a historic preservationist sort of by necessity, by passion, you see the need, right? When you're researching a community and see the danger in which its historic structures are, you become a historic preservationist. So that having been said, I'd like to just start today first by talking a bit about what the Beman Triangle was, where it's located, a brief introduction for those who are not familiar with it, then talk about the 19th century and early 20th century historical significance of this neighborhood, particularly the well-known African-American people, institutions that came out of this neighborhood and that helped form the neighborhood. And finally, the historic homes that survive, which are in a lot of ways the most remarkable feature of this neighborhood, that about half a dozen 19th century Black homes are extant. And I think having not just one or two homes, but the core of a 19th century, early 19th century Black neighborhood intact is pretty remarkable, is quite remarkable and unusual. Finally, I'll talk about current research and commemorative efforts that are going on. In short, a team of us at the Middlesex County Historical Society, where I'm director, are getting the Beman Triangle on the National Register of Historic Places, and we just submitted our nomination form to the State Historic Preservation Office last month. So it's now in their hands, and we'll be getting feedback from them. The Beman Triangle has been on the State Register of Historic Places and the Connecticut Freedom Trail for 2 decades now, but this would be its first national recognition, this process. And then the final thing I'll talk about is I saw one of the questions posted was what kind of sources, primary sources are available for this neighborhood or neighborhoods like it. And that's a really interesting, rich topic. So we'll get into that. But first, so where and what is the Beman Triangle for those who are not familiar? This is a map. This is the triangle itself. You can see the triangle where it says Vine Street, Park Street, and Cross. That's the triangle we're talking about. This is a map from the 1874 Middlesex County, Connecticut Property Atlas. And I think a lot of people in Connecticut know and love these 1870s property atlases that show you every business, every home, every property owner in essentially every town and city in Connecticut. So you see that triangle there, Vine, Park, and Cross. To the right of that, you'll see a little green triangle that says African ME Church. That was the Cross Street African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. Then to the left of the triangle is Indian Hill Cemetery. So this neighborhood, bounded by Cross, Park Street is now Vine Street, and Vine Street is now Knowles Avenue, is now part of Wesleyan University's campus, the western edge of its campus. So this neighborhood was a free Black community from 1828 until the 1930s, when the last African-American property owners sold their property and left. Then it became a working class white neighborhood from the 1930s onward. And then in the 80s and 90s, 1980s and 1990s, Wesleyan acquired all but one of the properties on the Beman Triangle as part of its campus expansion. So that's a brief overview of how this became part of campus. Wesleyan did not acquire them directly from Black property owners, and Black property owners certainly didn't build this community because of Wesleyan. They happened to grow up next to each other, alongside each other, and now it's part of campus. This is a modern day aerial view. You'll see Indian Hill Cemetery is on the left. The Wesleyan Athletic Center is across the street from the triangle where all the pins are. And then the core of campus is to the right there. So this, and I wanted to just briefly show this. This is current day Vine Street. And you'll see that pink house in the middle was built in 1833 by a free Black woman named Eunice Cambridge. That house, the one immediately to the right of it, and the one to the right of that, all date from the 1830s to the 1850s, and are all free Black built and free Black owned homes. And then the ones immediately to the left and right of those three are late 19th century homes that African Americans rented at various points. So I just want to flag how remarkable it is to have this largely intact 19th century streetscape, that's extant, that hasn't been demolished. And one reason why it's extant is because Wesleyan did purchase them and is using them, is currently using them as student housing, has been for about 3 decades now. And also the Beman Triangle, which I'll talk about a little bit in greater detail in a few minutes, is about a mile from Main Street in Middletown, about a mile from the river. So this was somewhat marginal, somewhat swampy, semi-agricultural community. We have records of free Black people here in the 1860s and 70s and 80s, with large gardens that they were growing vegetables and selling those vegetables. They had barns and chickens and horses. So this was, not a traditional urban community, even though Middletown was a small city, and it wasn't a rural community. It was a really interesting sort of semi-rural, free Black property owning neighborhood. In a lot of ways, I think the reason why it survives in such to such a degree is because it wasn't demolished as part of the highway project in the 50s and 60s. It wasn't demolished as part of urban renewal. It's more on the outskirts. So taking you back to the origins, if anyone's familiar with Wesleyan University's campus, this is the top of that hill on where Church Street becomes Cross Street. On the left here is Wesleyan University's library, Olin Library, and on the right is the Science Center. And in a lot of ways, the community and the neighborhood formed around the Cross Street African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. So to give you some chronology, to give you some landmarks, Middletown's African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, AME Zion Church, organized in 1823. So they celebrated their 200th anniversary last year, which means that they were only the third free Black church to form in Connecticut. The first was in Hartford in 1819, I'm sorry, New Haven in 1818, then 1819 in Hartford, and then Cross Street AME Zion Church was in 1823. So this was one of the first 3 or 4 free Black churches forming in Connecticut. So it was right at the vanguard of free Black community building after Connecticut slavery was gradually abolished between the 1780s and 1820s. So the Cross Street AME Zion Church forms in 1823. 1828, the first free people of color began buying property on what's now the Beman Triangle. And then within a year, by 1829, they build their first church building. And the church building is where that Science Center is now. So the church was there for nearly a century, from 1829 until 1921. Wesleyan acquired that property for its initial campus expansion. And then the church literally moved down the street. That's the church building on the left. That's a 19th century church building from 1867. Literally moved up Cross Street, was there until about 1980, and then was demolished to build the one on the right you see there. And now in 2008, the church moved a mile away to this current church, where the congregation is now. So it's been through 4 buildings in 2 centuries, but the Cross Street AME Zion Church is going strong at 201 years old, and was really the nucleus of this neighborhood and its anti-slavery activity, its abolition activity, its free Black community formation. And as part of this process of getting the Beman Triangle on the National Register of Historic Places, we're working very closely, for instance, with Marty Lohman, who's the congregational historian, 3rd generation member of Cross Street AME Zion Church. So we're just a mile away from Cross Street, and I've been partners with them in uncovering and telling this story. So why is it called the Beman Triangle? What's the history there? Well, before I get to this is the manumission law, how the free Black communities formed in Connecticut. So to tell the story of why this is called the Beman Triangle, how the Bemans ended up in Middletown, I have to say a word about slavery in Connecticut. And maybe a decade or 2 ago, it was still news to a lot of people that slavery existed in Connecticut. I think in the past 5-10 years, there's been a really impressive movement to uncover and tell the story of slavery in Connecticut. So fewer and fewer people are unaware of slavery in Connecticut, but there's still so much to be learned about Black life under slavery in Connecticut, Black life during gradual emancipation, free Black life. So in the 1700s, by the 1770s, on the eve of the American Revolution, Connecticut had the most enslaved people of any New England colony. We in Rhode Island had about the same, about 5,000 people of African descent enslaved here. And by 1784, when this law was passed, a year after the American Revolution, abolition in Connecticut didn't look like emancipation in the South, where there was an edict saying that freedom will take effect on a certain day. The gradual emancipation law passed in 1784 said if you were born after that date, March 1st, 1784, you would be free at age 25. And if you were already alive, if you're already living on March 1st, 1784, the law did not require you to be freed. So there were still a handful of enslaved people in Connecticut 64 years later in 1848, when the Connecticut legislature finally abolished all slavery. However, because of this law, which basically said slavery will be phased out over a generation, as well as the resistance of enslaved people who escaped, who bought their freedom, who fought in the American Revolution in some cases, slavery actually dissolved faster than the law required. So by the 1820s, almost all people of African descent in Connecticut were free and started forming communities and the kind of churches I mentioned, including the Cross Street Amy Zion Church in 1823. So skipping ahead to Reverend Jehiel Beman. So again, it's 1830 now. The Cross Street Amy Zion Church was established 7 years earlier. Reverend Jehiel Beman comes to Middletown from Colchester to be the first regular pastor of this church, which is now, again, where Wesleyan's Science Center is now. For those not familiar with the Bemans, they had regional and national prominence in the abolitionist movement and the Black temperance movement, what was called the moral reform movement before the Civil War. So they were really statewide and regional leaders of the free Black community that had formed by the 1820s and 30s. Reverend Jehiel Beman, some might be familiar, his parents, Caesar and Sarah Beman, had been enslaved in Colchester, Connecticut, and his father was one of about 200 Black men who gained their freedom by fighting in the American Revolution in the Continental Army. So he fought in the American Revolution in place of his enslaver in Colchester. And the story that Jehiel Beman told was that when his father was freed, he chose a surname and he said he, quote, wanted to be a man and not a slave. So Beman comes from that, be a man, Beman. That's where his father gained his surname and when he gained his freedom. Reverend Jehiel Beman, raised in Colchester, went to the one-room, quote, African school, as it was called, which has actually now been restored as a museum in Colchester. So Colchester, even though it was a small rural Black community, they managed to establish a school right after, by the late 1700s, right after emancipation. And that's where Reverend Jehiel Beman was educated, and he went on to become a minister. So they come here in 1830. His wife, Fanny Condell Beman, she passed away in 1830, shortly after they arrived in Middletown. And this is her gravestone in the cemetery almost directly across the street from the Beman Triangle. So the cemetery is another really important part of this historic site. Some of you might know the work of Vicki Welch, who's published a 9-generation family history of the Condells, who were of African and indigenous descent and came from Lyme, Connecticut. So Jehiel and Fanny Beman's son, Reverend Amos Beman, is probably the most prominent and famous member of the Beman family. He went on to be pastor in New Haven of the Dixwell Avenue Congregational Church and was a national figure in terms of the National Black Conventions, National Anti-Slavery Movement. And he was a pastor all as far north as, say, Portland, Maine. So he was the most mobile and prominent of the Beman family, Reverend Amos Beman. And some of you might be familiar with his scrapbooks, which are at the Beinecke Library and are digitized, and that's where this portrait of him comes from. But there was another brother named Leverett Beman, and I'm really fascinated by Leverett because while Amos Beman was off in New Haven and playing this national role in the anti-slavery movement, Leverett Beman was one of the really, I think, understudied, underappreciated figures in free Black communities who was he was a mainstay of the Cross Street Amy Zion Church. He was a mainstay of the community, but really most of his work was local and occasionally at the state level. But he wasn't really seeking national attention or national prominence. He really did his work locally in Middletown. And again, mostly as an officer as trustee of the Cross Street Amy Zion Church. So this is really the origin of the Beman Triangle as an organized free Black neighborhood. What you're looking at here is an 1847 survey map that Leverett Beman had done by the city of Middletown. So 1828, I mentioned the first people of color bought property in the triangle. That was George Jeffrey and his wife, Mary Ann Jeffrey. They were in parcel number F here at the bottom right of the map. So they bought that property in 1828 as the first free people of color on the triangle of land. Shortly afterwards, the church started meeting in their home before they built their own church house up the street. Fast forward to 1846, George Jeffrey passes away, and essentially at that point he owned almost all of the triangle except for that one house at lot C over there. So when he passes away, he happened to be Leverett Beman's brother-in-law, and the property was heavily mortgaged. So he was in danger. His widow, Mary Ann Jeffrey, was in danger of losing the property to white creditors. So what Leverett Beman did is he stepped in and took over the mortgage from his sister-in-law for $400, bought the entire triangle, and he divided it into these 11 parcels that you see that are lettered A through K. And he then went and within a year, by 1847, sold each of those remaining parcels to other free African Americans, most of whom, like him, were officers in the local African Methodist Church. So within a year, by 1847, this triangle became entirely African American, entirely property owning neighborhood. And I think that's one of the main things that stands out as unique to this neighborhood, is that by 1847, it was highly organized and planned, and it didn't develop haphazardly. Leverett Beman subdivided it and intentionally sold it to other free Black leaders like himself. And really through the 1850s and 60s, on the eve of the Civil War and after the Civil War, these 11 house lots remained entirely Black owned. So just to talk a little bit about the broader historical context in which this neighborhood was forming, I want to talk about what was going on in Middletown in the 1820s and 30s. So David Walker's Appeals, published in 1829, and really the Bemans point to this as a lot of ways the beginning of their activism. So David Walker's Appeal is published by a free Black man in Boston who basically says that free people of color and enslaved people in the United States are the most oppressed people in the history of the world, which arguably was absolutely true, and that if slavery weren't abolished, the enslaved should take up arms and rebel. So, people like Nat Turner, who came along a couple years later. So this pamphlet terrified enslavers, but for free Black activists like the Bemans, this became sort of their second Bible. So Amos Beman, for example, wrote decades later that he, quote, read and reread David Walker's Appeal, quote, until it was stamped in letters of fire upon our soul. So this really was the origin of their anti-slavery work in 1829. And free Black activists like David Walker really were at the heart of abolitionism, of the movement to abolish slavery. It was really white abolitionists like the more widely known William Lloyd Garrison who really followed the lead of people like David Walker rather than the other way around. And David Walker's Appeal included this really interesting quotation about the dispossession of free Black people in the United States. He said that, basically, I'll paraphrase, he said that even if a free Black person manages to acquire property, they're always cheated by a white creditor. They're always cheated by the executor of the estate when they died. So in this context, Leverett Beman buying this property from his widowed sister-in-law and keeping it within the Black community is a central form of activism. It's not just an economic issue, but a political issue as well. 2 years later, 1831, William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator comes out, which is in a lot of ways credited as the beginning of the immediate abolition movement, as opposed to the colonization movement to gradually abolish slavery. And the Bemans, among others, instantly become agents who are selling this paper, circulating it within Middletown, and writing into the paper. And within 3 years of this, women in the Beman family, Clarissa Beman and Nancy Beman, so Jehiel Beman's wife and daughter-in-law, they found what's called the Colored Female Anti-Slavery Society of Middletown, which was only the third Black women's abolitionist society in the United States. So they founded that in the Cross Street Amy Zion Church in 1834, within 3 years of the Liberator's emergence. The same year, in 1834, Jehiel Beman is a co-founder of the Middlesex County Anti-Slavery Society. And then 4 years later, when Connecticut forms its first state anti-slavery society, Jehoiakim Beman's one of the leaders. So really, I just want to emphasize that free Black independence, free Black property ownership, and this, what we consider the organized anti-slavery movement, really went hand in hand. That, and among other reasons, a lot of colonizationists who advocated the deportation of free Black people to Liberia, and pro-slavery writers at the time really were saying that people of color were not fit or able to take care of themselves, that slavery or deportation to Liberia were the best future for freed people of color. And for the Bemans, education, temperance, and respectability, property owning independence really flew in the face of this racist ideology. And they absolutely were writing about this in their letters to the Liberator, at their anti-slavery meetings, and really creating this counter narrative to the really racist public sphere. Just one example, Wesleyan University was founded 3 years after the first Black property owners on the Triangle in 1831. And the first president of Wesleyan, Wilbur Fisk, was both the first president of Wesleyan and the first president of the Connecticut Colonization Society. So the Colonization Society, with its idea that freed Black people could only thrive, could only be equal if they self-deport to Liberia, was the predominant ideology of the time. And it's what the Bemans and other free Black people and other property owners like them were contending with and refuting. Thinking a little bit more about the political context in Connecticut and the political ramifications of free Black property ownership during this period, as a lot of you might know, Connecticut was the last state in New England to continue to deny the vote to free Black men. So free Black men in Connecticut did not gain the vote until 1870, when freed people in the South gained the vote under the 15th Amendment. So in 1847 and again in 1865, the majority of white voters in Connecticut voted down Black suffrage. So twice it came before the all-white, all-male electorate in Connecticut, and both times they overwhelmingly voted to uphold the ban on Black voting. That's in the 1818 Connecticut State Constitution. So the idea of citizenship and property ownership and voting rights are highly connected, right? Initially, only white property owners could vote in this country. It was really only during the 1830s with Jacksonian democracy that you now had propertyless white people who could vote. And when you see during Jacksonian democracy, at the same time, you have white propertyless men who could vote. The restriction on Black citizenship is only tightening more and more rather than expanding. So for activists like the Bemans, they petitioned the Connecticut legislature again and again, saying, you know, we're taxpayers, we're property owners. The American Revolution was about no taxation without representation. We pay our taxes, we have property, and yet we're disenfranchised. And actually, in a little known chapter of Connecticut history, in 1844, the Connecticut legislature actually exempted Black property owners from paying taxes rather than give them the vote. So they said, okay, fine, no taxation without representation, don't pay property tax. And that was not repealed until 1871 in the wake of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. So, I'm just trying to convey here how contentious and what an uphill battle they had for basic citizenship rights. This is an article from a local newspaper from 1847 saying a suffrage meeting of colored people will be held in the Amy Zion Church right there on Cross Street across from the Beman Triangle to organize a petition campaign for the vote. So these are just some of the documents, newspapers, and other published material that tells this story. And if you haven't heard of the colored conventions, they were in Connecticut. They were in every northern and midwestern state and western state. And then after the Civil War, freed people held them in southern states as well. But essentially, these conventions, in a lot of ways, were the pinnacle of free Black political activism before the Civil War, because they were effectively like congresses for free people of color who were otherwise disenfranchised from the political process. Free Black communities like those in Middletown elected delegates to go to these state and national Black conventions where they organized petition campaigns. where they organized committees to advocate for abolition, temperance, property ownership. So this was one form of political activism that came out of meetings like that one at the Cross Street Amy Zion Church. These are the published minutes of the 1849 convention held in New Haven. And if you look, you can see Jehiel Beman, his son Amos, were among the state leaders. You might see other familiar names too. You see Hartford sent 4 delegates, Middletown sent 1, New Haven sent 2. So if you go to coloredconventions.org, all of the proceedings have been digitized and are searchable, and they're an incredible record of antebellum free Black activism and communities, including the ones in Middletown. But this is a historic preservation meeting, so I want to talk about the houses before I run out of time. So as I said, it's remarkable that half a dozen of these homes are still survive from the 19th century. I just want to run you through some images of these remarkable homes. This is 9 Vine Street in Middletown. This was the first Black-owned property home developed on the Triangle, predating Leverett Beman's purchase of the property. This one dates to 1833. So I just want to show you this an exterior and an interior view of the home. Right next door at 11 Vine is a circa 1851 Isaac and Eliza Truett house. There's Isaac Truett, a photo of him. He went on to fight in the Civil War in his mid-40s and was promoted to a sergeant, and is buried across the street in that cemetery I mentioned on Vine Street. And he's interesting in the sense that before the Civil War, the vast majority of people of color on the Beman Triangle were the descendants of those who had been enslaved in New England. And a lot of them were of mixed African and Native American ancestry. The Truetts were an exception. He was born into slavery in Delaware and came north either through self-purchase or through the Underground Railroad shortly before the Civil War. So he was one of the very few antebellum Southern-born Black residents. Some of you might know Frank Mitchell, who's a historian and museum curator here in Connecticut, based in New Haven. He's a great-great-grandson of Isaac and Eliza Truett. So he's been to the home many times, as have cousins of his from all over the country. Next door at 19 Vine Street is the circa 1850 Elizabeth Condell Henry house. She was a sister-in-law to Jehiel Beman, his wife Fanny Condell Beman's sister. And then at 170 Cross Street on the other side of the Triangle, this home dates to shortly after the Civil War. It's on the site of the original Jeffrey House, which was the first Black-owned home built there in 1828. This replaced it in the 1870s. But among other remarkable things about the Dingle family, Emily was widow of Amster Dingle here, who fought in the 29th Connecticut. He was one of about a dozen Black men from Middletown who fought in the Black regiments from Connecticut, the 29th, 30th, and 31st. So he, like Isaac Truett, was born enslaved in Delaware and then went on to fight to end slavery nationally during the Civil War. And on that note, one other political or historical tie-in to this is that we have documentation that the Cross Street Church and likely homes on the Beman Triangle were stops on the Underground Railroad as well. So Jehiel Beman and his son Amos Beman were close friends and associates with Frederick Douglass, for example, and they brought him to Middletown to speak on at least 3 occasions in 1845, 1855, and then after the Civil War in the 1870s. But we have some people say, well, where are your sources? The Underground Railroad is so difficult to trace. In 1854, Jehiel Beman openly defied the Fugitive Slave Act and wrote this letter to Frederick Douglass's newspaper, which Frederick Douglass published. But just a little excerpt. He said, Frederick Douglass, I would inform you that we have had a recent arrival from the land of chains and whips, where the image of the divine being is bought and sold. But thank the good Lord, when he arrived at our office, we at once recognized him as a man and a brother. And then he goes on to say his conveyance with the Underground Railroad, and he says the cars run day and night. So he's kind of playing on this idea of the Underground Railroad as an actual train, right? And this is a remarkable letter. And then, as I mentioned, Amster Dingle was one of about a dozen Black men from the Beman Triangle who fought in the 3 Connecticut regiments to abolish Southern slavery, sort of culminating and following up on the 3 decades of anti-slavery activity and Underground Railroad activity centered on the Beman Triangle, and dozens of free Black communities like it throughout New England. This is the text of the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870. As I mentioned, so the 5 years after the Civil War, when Southern slavery is abolished by the 13th Amendment, the 15th Amendment finally now grants the vote, at least in law, at least in theory, to Black men, not women, nationally, including in the Southern states. And I love this document because it says on the bottom, printed for Amos G. Beman. So Amos G. Beman, who'd been advocating for the vote, advocating for citizenship rights at that point, his entire life, 50 years, had this printed so that he could basically waive the text of the 15th Amendment and show that he was a citizen finally and that he could vote. So in a lot of ways, the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, and the 15th Amendment in 1870 are sort of high points and culminations of these freedom movements. But there's also a sadder economic history that dovetails this political history, and that is that even as political equality was proclaimed by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, the economic status of Black people in Connecticut really deteriorated in the late 1800s, largely because you started having much more widespread immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe. So for instance, before the Civil War, all the barbers in Middletown were free Black men. By the early 20th century, all the barbers were Italian immigrants. Factories sprang up all over Connecticut, and they only hired working class white people, including European immigrants, to work in these factories. African Americans were excluded from factory work until the Great Migration began in 1916. So that's one reason why a lot of the African American residents of Middletown on the Beman Triangle left in the 1890s, turn of the 20th century, for larger cities where there was a little bit more of an economic foothold. So that's the reason why by 1900, 1910, 1920s, you see largely Swedish and Polish and Italian people buying these homes. And the Beman Triangle became a working class white neighborhood by that point. And then, as I said, sadly, 1937, height of the Great Depression, the last couple of Black property owners sell their property and leave Middletown. And I think the Great Depression, in a lot of ways, was the final nail in the coffin for those Black property owners on the Beman Triangle. But this community had a 109-year run as a center of Black life in Connecticut from 1828 to 1937. I think that's remarkable. I also think the extent to which the homes are preserved, even though they're not being used for historic purposes, the fact that they're there is promising and gives a lot of potential for this as a site for education, a cultural center, and a center of the abolitionist movement and the movement for Black suffrage. So Middletown and the Beman Triangle in particular were state and national centers for this crucial history. I just wanted to jump ahead to what's going on currently. So as I mentioned, the Middlesex County Historical Society, we are working to get national recognition, get this neighborhood placed on the National Register of Historic Places. It's been on the Connecticut Freedom Trail and the State Register for 2 decades. The team of us who are working on it is myself. I mentioned Marty Lohman, who's the congregational historian of the Cross Street Amy Zion Church, Alan Munn-Kittrick, who's an architectural historian who has unearthed a lot of new information about the vernacular architecture of the homes themselves. And then Deborah Shapiro, who's the Middletown municipal historian, who did title searches for each of the property to really clarify who's lived there, who's owned these properties over since 1828. And it really totals hundreds of people who have lived and or rented these homes. So this was a real crossroads and hub for free Black community during that period. Some of you asked about sources, and I would just say that this research, when you're doing community research, especially on free Black communities and other marginalized communities, it's really a scavenger hunt. There's no central archive on the Beman Triangle. The sources are land records. Like I said, Deborah Shapiro's done title searches of the Middletown land records. So property deeds tell part of the story, who was buying and selling these properties, and some general descriptions of the property boundaries. City directories, census records, tax records, and then, as I mentioned, newspapers, the Liberator and other abolitionist newspapers, for example, Frederick Douglass's newspaper, give you glimpses of the political aspect of this neighborhood, the Underground Railroad activity, the abolitionist activity. So you piece together about a dozen different sources and you get, it's never as complete a picture as you like, but it's worth the years and years of research. I was going to say years of digging. There have been 2 archaeological investigations on the Beman Triangle, and I'd be happy to talk about that further. But as I said, I want to leave plenty of time for questions because my background, as I said, is in history. I'm not an expert in historic preservation, so I'm grateful and eager to hear your ideas, your suggestions for all of this. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Jesse. That was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
I'm happy to open the floor up to any questions or comments that any of you have.
Hi, Jane. This is Elaine.
Hi, Elaine. Welcome.
And hi, Jesse. Thank you so much for that. That was fantastic. My question is about public interpretation, and is there the National Register obviously is really a great, an honor. It seems like this is a really critical resource in terms of thinking about that. But I wonder too, since it is something you could walk by and not even know, right, what you're seeing, is there a public interpretation plan of any kind in the works for this?
Good question. So there has been a Middletown Heritage Trail marker there for a couple decades. So there's a plaque nearby just telling the story of the neighborhood. We're doing some online digital interpretations that people can at least look it up. If you Google it now, there's a site that we're currently revamping. So my students have been researching this. I've taught a course on the Beman Triangle for 6 years now. So dozens of my students have done projects. A small sample of their work is online there. But as part of this process, we will be putting together a book that people can pick up, a pamphlet people can pick up as part of learning about this and interpretation. We'll put up additional signage. My vision, my hope would be that eventually one of these homes would be turned into a historic and cultural center where it's a center where people can visit and there'd be tons of interpretation, right? It would be a building worth of that. So that though depends on property owners and et cetera, et cetera. So kind of the ultimate goal up here is to turn one of the homes into a cultural center and museum where it'd be interpretation. In the meantime, we have plans for publication, signage, and online digital exhibits but that's a great question and a really important issue. Thank you.
Thanks for your question, Elaine. How much interaction do you have with the current property owners?
Well, in some ways, the situation is easy and in some ways it's difficult. There are 19 buildings on the Beman Triangle. I'm sorry, 20 buildings on the Beman Triangle currently. The university, Wesleyan, owns 19 of the 20. So really, Wesleyan has supported our effort to put this on the National Register. So by partnering with and getting Wesleyan support, we by default are working with 19 of the 20 relevant property owners, or property owners. There's one of the 20 is privately owned, and that owner has let us go in and photograph the 19th century house. But really, that's the situation is that Wesleyan's support of this project is crucial because they own essentially all of the properties since the 80s and 90s.
Any of this planning to go virtual, like a virtual cultural center?
Yeah, so again, if you look for the Beman Triangle now, there's a website that we're in the middle of revamping. So once that's up there, you'll have additional images of each house with stories. So the digital component's in construction right now. I see. Is there a site can I add it to the Connecticut State Library Guide for History? Please email me. I'll put my email in the chat box. Anyone who wants to email me privately, I'd be happy to send you links and things you could add to resource lists.
Super. Does anyone else want to ask Jesse a question?
Oh, I see a lot in the chat. So, Marta, nice to see you, Marta. Any descendants of Venture Smith who lived in the Triangle? Yes. So this is interesting. So Venture Smith, who some of you know him from his narrative, he published one of the only narratives by an enslaved person who was born in Africa and enslaved in New England. His grandson, George Smith, owned a property on the Beman Triangle. He built a house on the triangle around 1865 and lived there for a couple decades. Sadly, his house is not one of the half dozen that survived. So it looks like George Smith's house was taken down about a century ago, but he did live there. And he actually married a woman. Venture Smith's grandson married a woman who grew up on Nine Vine, which is the oldest house that does survive. So there's a double Venture Smith connection there. Yes, yes.
Yeah, I see you had your hand raised. Would you like to ask a question? You have to unmute.
Yep.
There you go.
I was involved with an effort in New Haven some years ago now to save properties that Amos Beman owned here on House Street in New Haven. And there was a proposal by a developer to tear them down for a building project that the developer wanted to do. That was stopped, but now the properties appear to be just, it's kind of demolition by neglect, is how it looks to me. And unfortunately, there hasn't been any active engagement that we can see by the Attorney General's office to do anything about that. I just wondered if you have any active connection at this time with people from New Haven for especially the Amos Beman part of the family story.
So you know what? I was at those hearings in Hartford when we contested the demolition. I'm going to say that was 2018 or 2019. So I'm glad that was stopped. I hear you that demolition by neglect is not good either. I'm going to reach out. I also want to plug the Connecticut Freedom Trail because I'm on a committee. A few of you here are on the Freedom Trail Committee, and the Freedom Trail is a network of over 130, I want to say, sites throughout the state that have ties to African American history. So in New Haven, I will start by talking to Connecticut Freedom Trail because we're linked. You know, the Connecticut Freedom Trail is linked to cities and towns across the state. So I'll start there. But I'm sorry to hear they're kind of neglected, that property.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Pat.
Oh, lots of great questions here. Descendants, some of you asked about recordings with descendants. I've brought a couple descendants to campus to speak at conferences and symposia that I organized. I have those recordings and those will go on the website. So I briefly want to mention one descendant named Eric Smith. He's a genealogist based in Chicago. He's a descendant of the Jeffreys, who were the Beman's in-laws who built the first homes on the Triangle. He's actually writing a book about his Jeffrey ancestors that's coming out soon. So, you know, I'll try to have him back. And, you know, so it's great to have a descendant who's actively publishing the family history to collaborate with. Frank Mitchell comes to mind as another descendant. And it's a great question, you know, well, it's a great project to record additional descendants. There's a question at its height, how many buildings were owned by African Americans? At its height in the 1850s, there were all 11 house lots were owned by African Americans. About a half dozen houses were owned by African Americans because some of the lots were not built on, if that makes sense. So we're talking about, I want to say 6 or 8 houses were Black owned, and then the additional 3 lots were owned by African Americans, but not all of them were built on. So at its height, we're talking about maybe a dozen families. And I should mention that in terms of significance, some might say, well, a dozen families, what's the big deal? But when you think about it, a dozen families, that was the majority of Middletown's Black community. There were only about 200 African Americans in Middletown. So when you consider that Connecticut was something like 97% white before the Civil War, having an enclave of a dozen Black families was one of the largest Black neighborhoods, considering that the state was 97% white. So in relative terms, a dozen families was the majority of Middletown's community, which in turn was one of the largest Black communities in the state. Because again, we're not talking about the South, you know, we're talking about Connecticut in the 1830s and 40s, which Having a Black community of 12 families was put you on the map, let's put it that way. And to have them in a property owning organized sort of cluster instead of scattered all over. And then you said, what other predominantly Black 19th century neighborhoods have been identified in Middletown? Good question. This was really it. So outside of the Beman Triangle, you had about 100 African Americans living scattered throughout the town. But I would say this was the only organized neighborhood. And it makes sense when you think that the only Black church in Middletown was there across the street from the Triangle on Cross Street. So the church and the community went hand in hand. How do the homes and owners link to the cemetery? So the cemetery on Vine Street, the majority of African Americans buried in the cemetery on Vine Street lived on the Triangle. So they were closely linked, if that answers the question. And then you have lots of good suggestions about history pin as a platform, story maps. Absolutely. There's a lot of interesting ways that our website will tell the story digitally and visually. One example, we're using the quote coloredconventions.org. They're doing a good job of using story maps to say map Amos Beman's travels, where he traveled as a lecturer and an activist. So mapping, mapping is incredible, right? You can see the connections among otherwise seemingly disparate communities and people. Good question. Were there any commercial enterprises catering to the small Black community? One thing I find is that economically, because the community was so small, again, there's only about 150 people, 200 people at its height. The only Black-owned businesses I found were the Bemans were shoemakers, and then there were a couple barbers free Black men who owned barbershops. But really, by necessity, they catered to anyone who would buy their shoes or get their hair cut there. Because when you had a community of 150 people, a lot of them who were very, working class, you couldn't sustain yourself. So it's interesting. They had white customers and they had Black customers, and in turn, the people on the Beman Triangle, you see that a lot of them went to white pharmacists, bought their groceries at white stores, because again, they're with a place like Middletown that was 97, 98% white. Even though the church was all Black and the neighborhood, this enclave, this 3-acre enclave, was all Black, it was a very interconnected world between white and Black people in Middletown by nature, by necessity. They were neighbors, and the businesses, again, you had to cater to everyone.
What is your expected timeline on your book, Jesse?
I'm looking for within about a year, so I'll keep you posted about that. And then the website, I'm going to start with the website. That will be out within, let's give that a 6 to 12 month timeline. So we'll go digital first, and then the book will be a work in progress after the website.
Wonderful. That's excellent.
In a lot of ways, there's more demand, immediate demand for just basic information about these houses, because so many people pass them and don't know about them. So step one is get the information online, get it out there, especially to people who walk by these houses or students who live in these houses and need to treat them with more respect, So that's the first priority. And a lot of that information will come out of the National Register process. We're putting together the research that went into that. And the legacy of the neighborhood today, someone asked, I think the most visible legacy is the church, which is now 201 years old. So in Middletown, like a lot of places throughout Connecticut, in the 20th century, those who came from the South and their descendants are now the vast majority of the community. There's a lot more African Americans in Middletown today who can trace their ancestors to the South, who have come north within the past century, than who were here in the 1800s, just demographically. However, those who came from the South kept the Cross Street Church going for the past century when the demographics dropped off of Northern-born African Americans in Middletown. So I would say that's one of the legacies. And the descendants, of course.
Mm-hmm. And are there many extant historic objects connected with the Bemans and other families that could be included in the culture center?
That's a great, they're scattered, but the Connecticut Museum for History and Culture, formerly the Connecticut Historical Society, has a Beman family Bible, which is a treasure. The Beinecke has Amos Beman scrapbooks, which include his own ephemera, letters he published in abolitionist newspapers. They have, so the short answer to that is that this cultural center would take a lot of digital images with permission from other institutions because the objects are scant. However, there were 2 archaeological digs on the triangle, led by a Wesleyan professor named Sarah Croucher. So those objects, things like medicine bottles and combs and tobacco pipes, pipe stems that show the everyday life on the triangle, in a lot of ways, those are our most numerous objects because they came out of the ground, whereas other objects have been scattered or lost. And as you know, in the world, 19th century museums were not collecting shoes made by free Black people. It was not, they were focused on, say, heroes of the American Revolution, right? They were not. So the collection, what was valued until recent decades, was not these objects. So if you find any, please let me know. But yeah, so ways to make this history into educational opportunities. I should say I was one of a group of about a dozen people who got the middle school in Middletown named the Beman Middle School. So there's now a school named after the Beman family, and the Beman family is introduced into the curriculum there, the middle school curriculum, and we're working on the high school as well. So the Beman name and story is getting out.
Mhm. That's terrific. I think we picked up all the questions in the chat. Thank you all, everyone, for your participation and joining us today. And thank you, Jesse. This is
My
very
pleasure.
exciting work. We look
My
forward to seeing the National Register nomination and the website and the book and everything else. So
We'll be
please
in touch.
keep us informed of your progress.
We'll be in touch. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.